There are some people who are born not to be left alone. They arrive in this world quietly, like anyone else. Yet, history seems to keep an eye on them from the very beginning. Not because they are stronger than others or wiser at birth, but because one day they will be forced to choose. And that choice will not belong to them alone. It will belong to their people. Imagine being born in a land that has not yet been allowed to know its own name. A place where the soil beneath your feet is ancient, but the rules that govern your life come from far away. Where your elders remember freedom in whispers, and your children are taught obedience as survival. In such a place, standing upright is not a natural posture. It is a decision. For many of our ancestors, silence was safety. Keep your head down. Do your work. Feed your family. Live another day. There is no shame in that. Survival itself is a form of wisdom, but history moves forward on the backs of those who eventually ask a dangerous question: if silence keeps me alive today, what will it cost my children tomorrow? This story begins in that question. Before titles, before politics, before the weight of a nation resting on one man's shoulders. It begins with a child born into a world already decided by others. A world where borders were drawn without consent, where names were assigned for convenience, and where dignity was something you were expected to borrow, never to own. The elders knew this world well. They had learned how to endure it. But endurance is not the same as freedom. Endurance keeps the body alive. Freedom keeps the spirit intact. And so the child grew, watching carefully, watching how power spoke, watching who was allowed to speak back, watching how people learned to bend without breaking, and how some broke anyway. Long before he would ever speak to crowds, he learned the language of observation. Long before he would write words meant to awaken millions, he learned what it meant to feel unseen. This is not a story about a man who sought greatness. It is the story of a man who could not ignore what he saw. A man who came to understand that the most dangerous prison is the one built inside the mind, where people are taught to accept limits that were never meant to be theirs. If you listen carefully to this story, you may hear echoes of your own, of parents who worked hard but were never invited into the rooms where decisions were made, of grandparents who knew their worth but lived in a world that refused to acknowledge it, of moments when you too felt the quiet pressure to make yourself smaller. Stay with this story until the end, not because it will tell you who to praise, but because it may remind you of something older than any nation. The truth that standing upright is never free. But once a people remember how to do it, they are never the same again. He was born into a land that existed long before maps gave it a name. The soil was old, rich with memory, but the rules that shaped daily life came from distant offices and foreign tongues. This was Nigeria before it learned to call itself a nation. A place assembled for convenience, not for belonging. And into that unfinished idea of a country, a child was born. His father worked within the colonial system, not because he believed in it, but because survival often required proximity to power without access to it. From his earliest days, the boy saw this contradiction clearly. He saw his father wake before dawn, dress with care, and leave to serve a structure that would never fully see him. It was a lesson no classroom could teach. You could be necessary, yet never trusted. Because of his father's work, the child grew up moving between regions, between languages, between worlds, north and south. Different customs, different faiths, different expectations. While others learned to see difference as threat, he learned to live inside it. He listened. He observed. He noticed how the same land could feel like many countries, depending on who was speaking. At school, he proved sharp and disciplined. He absorbed knowledge quickly, not out of vanity, but out of instinct. In a world that limited what you were allowed to become, learning was one of the few forms of quiet resistance. He learned languages not just to speak, but to understand. He learned how people thought, how they justified authority, how obedience was framed as order. Yet even as he succeeded, something remained unsettled. He could feel it in small moments, in the way certain doors opened easily, while others remained firmly shut, in the way praise was offered, but trust was withheld, in the way his people were spoken about, even when they were present. He began to sense that this land suffered from more than foreign rule. It suffered from fragmentation. Communities were encouraged to see themselves as separate, competing, incomplete. And the danger was not only political, it was spiritual. A people divided long enough might forget that unity had ever been possible. This awareness did not arrive as anger. It arrived as responsibility. The quiet understanding that if no one learned to speak across these divisions, the future would inherit the same fractures. That if no one learned to imagine a shared destiny, the land would remain a collection of borders without a soul. Long before he would speak of independence, long before crowds would chant his name, he carried this truth privately. A nation is not born when a flag is raised. It is born when its people begin to see themselves as one. At a certain point, knowledge alone was no longer enough. The young man had learned how the system worked. He understood its language, its expectations, its unspoken rules. He knew how to succeed within it, at least on the surface. But beneath that success grew a quiet tension, a feeling that something essential was being left behind each time he moved forward, without questioning the ground beneath his feet. He carried a name that had been given for convenience, not inheritance, a name that fit neatly into colonial records, but did not belong to the rhythm of his ancestors' tongues. For many, this was a small compromise, a harmless adjustment in a difficult world, but for him, it became a question that would not let him rest. Names are not just sounds, they are memory, they are lineage. They tell you where you come from and who walks with you, even when you stand alone. To move through life, wearing a borrowed name, is to move slightly bent, even if no one notices. When he chose to reclaim his true name, it was not an announcement. There was no crowd, no applause, just a decision made quietly and carried deliberately. In that moment, he was not challenging authority. He was correcting himself. This choice changed the way he walked through the world, not because others treated him differently, but because he now carried himself with alignment. What he believed, what he spoke, and what he answered to were no longer divided. The inner fracture that many learned to live with began to close. With that alignment came clarity. he began to see how deeply colonization reached, not just into governments and economies, but into minds, into how people measured their worth, into how they introduced themselves, into how easily they accepted the idea that greatness belonged somewhere else. He understood then that liberation could not begin with laws or flags. It had to begin with self-recognition. A people who could not name themselves could never fully govern themselves. A people who doubted their own legitimacy would always seek approval from elsewhere. This was the moment when he stopped seeing education as a path to personal advancement alone. It became a tool, a responsibility, something to be used not just to elevate himself, but to help others stand straighter as well. He did not yet know where this path would lead. He did not know the cost it would demand. But he knew one thing with certainty: once a person chooses to stand upright in their own identity, there is no returning to a borrowed posture. This was not rebellion. It was restoration. And it marked the point where an intelligent young man began to transform into a man carrying a message larger than himself. America did not greet him as a promised land. It greeted him as a test. He arrived with hope shaped by distance, believing that education and discipline could lift a person beyond the limits of birth. He believed that effort mattered, that achievement spoke for itself. Many of our people carried that belief across the ocean, trusting that hard work would be enough. What he found instead was a different kind of wall. He studied by day and worked by night. He washed cars. He cleaned kitchens. He accepted labor that exhausted the body while the mind remained hungry. Not because he lacked intelligence, but because society had already decided where a man of his color belonged. He learned quickly that opportunity was often offered with conditions, and respect was rationed carefully. No sign needed to say it aloud. It lived in glances, in silence, in the way doors closed softly rather than being slammed. This was not the brutality of chains, but the quiet violence of exclusion. A system that smiled while it limited you. For the first time, he understood that oppression did not always shout. Sometimes it whispered. Sometimes it dressed itself as policy, as tradition, as order. And sometimes it convinced its victims that their struggle was personal failure rather than structural design. Yet this experience did not harden him. It sharpened him. He began to see a pattern larger than one country. What happened to black people in America echoed what happened to Africans under colonial rule. Different uniforms, different accents, same denial of full humanity. The same question hovering beneath it all: who is allowed to define worth? In classrooms and libraries, he connected these experiences. He studied history, not as distant facts, but as living forces. He saw how the story of Africa had been interrupted, rewritten, and diminished. And he understood that the damage went beyond stolen resources. It reached into the mind, teaching people to doubt themselves. This was where his vision widened. He stopped thinking only as a Nigerian. He began thinking as an African and as a black man among millions scattered across the world, bound by shared wounds and shared resilience. Pan-African consciousness did not come to him as a slogan. It arrived as recognition, a realization that the struggle was not isolated, that dignity, once denied in one place, weakened dignity everywhere, and that liberation, to be real, had to be both local and global. America showed him the chains that could not be seen, and by seeing them clearly, he learned how to speak about freedom with precision, not fantasy. He left that land carrying no illusions, but carrying something far more powerful: understanding. Understanding, once earned, cannot be taken away, and he would carry it home. When he returned home, he did not arrive quietly. He came back carrying words sharpened by experience and a vision shaped by struggle. He had seen how silence worked. He had seen how narratives could be used to keep people small. And he knew that before any nation could be free, its people had to remember who they were. He chose the pen, not because it was safe, but because it was precise. A bullet can silence a body. A sentence can awaken a people. Through newspapers and public writing, he began to speak directly to ordinary men and women. Not in the language of elites, but in words that carried weight without arrogance. He wrote to farmers, workers, students, and elders. He wrote to those who had been taught to believe that politics belonged to others. Every article carried risk. Colonial authorities watched closely. Editors were warned. Papers were threatened. But he understood something essential. Fear loses its power when truth is spoken consistently, even softly. His writing did not scream. It reminded people of dignity they had been encouraged to forget. It reminded them that being ruled was not the same as being inferior. And it reminded them that unity was not a dream, but a discipline. Across regions and languages, his words traveled. People who had never met him began to recognize themselves in what he wrote. They did not all agree with him, but they listened. And listening was the beginning. The pen placed him in an uncomfortable position. Too outspoken for those in power, too moderate for those who wanted immediate confrontation. He stood in the middle, insisting that liberation without moral grounding would only reproduce new forms of domination. He believed that freedom achieved without dignity would collapse under its own weight. That anger alone could not build a nation, and that words, carefully chosen, could prepare minds for responsibility, not just resistance. This path demanded patience. It demanded restraint, and it demanded a willingness to be misunderstood. But he accepted that cost, because he knew that revolutions driven only by rage often leave broken communities behind. With every column, every editorial, he was doing more than criticizing colonial rule. He was training a people to think of themselves as participants in history, not spectators. Teaching them that their voices mattered, even before ballots existed. In choosing the pen, he chose endurance over spectacle. And endurance, when sustained long enough, becomes transformation. As the dream of independence moved closer, the ground beneath him became less stable. The nation he had imagined in words now demanded structure, compromise, and leadership under pressure. Nigeria was not a single voice rising together. It was many voices, shaped by region, language, faith, and memory. Each carried its own fears. Each guarded its own future. He stepped into politics, knowing it would cost him more than it would give. Journalism had allowed distance. Politics demanded exposure. Some saw him as a unifier. Others saw him as a threat. To some, he was too Igbo. To others, not Igbo enough. To the north, He represented a future they feared might erase their influence. To the West, he was a rival whose vision challenged theirs. Standing between these forces required balance that few appreciated. He spoke of unity while navigating suspicion. He argued for cooperation while managing ambition. And often, he paid the price for refusing to inflame divisions for personal gain. It is easier to rally people by telling them who to blame than by asking them to share responsibility. The closer independence came, the louder the accusations grew. He was called naive, too idealistic, too willing to compromise. Yet compromise was not weakness to him. It was a recognition that a fractured land could not survive purity tests. Power demanded choices that were never clean. Align with one group and alienate another. Push too hard and risk collapse. Move too slowly and be accused of betrayal. There was no path that preserved approval on all sides. He accepted this reality quietly. Leadership, he learned, was often lonely. Not because no one surrounded you, but because no one fully stood where you stood. The weight of consequence belonged to you alone. In moments of doubt, he returned to the principle that had guided him from the beginning. A nation must be built, not seized, built with patience, built with dialogue, built with an understanding that wounds created over generations would not heal overnight. Independence arrived, but it did not bring instant harmony. The flag rose, yet the divisions remained. And he understood then that freedom was not a finish line. It was an obligation. To hold the center in a divided land is to be misunderstood by all sides. But he remained there, believing that the alternative was fragmentation. And fragmentation, once it begins, is far harder to reverse than conflict. He chose the harder path, not the one that guaranteed praise, but the one that offered the nation its best chance to endure. When power finally came into his hands, it did not arrive as protection. It arrived as exposure. He held the highest office in name, yet the ground beneath the nation continued to shift. The structures were fragile. Trust was thin. Old suspicions had not disappeared simply because independence had been declared. And soon, the pressure became unbearable. Accusations followed him: corruption, favoritism, weakness. Some were rooted in truth, mixed with exaggeration. Others were weapons sharpened by fear and ambition. In a divided land, blame always searches for a face. Then came the rupture, the sound of authority collapsing, not through debate, but through force. A military coup swept away the civilian order, and with it, the role he had spent his life preparing for. In a single moment, he was no longer president, no longer central, no longer protected by office. History often measures leaders by how long they hold power, but character is revealed by how they lose it. He did not call for revenge. He did not summon followers into the streets. He did not try to burn the house because he had been pushed out of the room. He stepped back, carrying disappointment without surrendering his principles. Nigeria would descend into years of instability and conflict, and he would live long enough to see the cost of fragmentation, written in blood and broken trust. Yet even then, he resisted the temptation to become bitter. Bitterness narrows vision, and he had spent his life trying to widen it. In his later years, stripped of illusion, he remained committed to the belief that Africans must liberate themselves mentally before they could ever be free politically. He spoke less, but his words carried the weight of lived consequence. He understood that his legacy would be debated, praised by some, questioned by others. That is the fate of those who choose the center in a polarized time. But legacy, to him, was never about monuments or unanimous approval. It was about posture. Did the people learn to stand a little straighter because you lived? Did you leave behind language strong enough to resist erasure? Did you show that power could be held without hatred and lost without dishonor? Nnamdi Azikiwe did not give his people a perfect nation. He gave them something more difficult and more durable. A vision of dignity rooted in thought, not force, in dialogue, not domination. And so his story rests among history legends. Not because he won every battle, but because he refused to surrender the soul of his people. His life reminds us that African history is not only made by conquerors, but by those who choose restraint when chaos invites cruelty. These are not just historical facts. They are lessons carried forward. For those who listen late into the night, for those who find reflection in history for sleep, for those who understand that Black history is not a tale of defeat, but of endurance. As long as these stories are told, the posture remains. And as long as the posture remains, the people endure. In the end, what remains is not a title, but a posture. Nnamdi Azikiwe lived long enough to see the world change around him, and to understand that no nation is finished simply because independence has been declared. Flags can be raised in a single day. Dignity takes generations to defend. He understood this truth not as theory, but as lived experience. He had chosen many times when it would have been easier not to choose at all. He chose to name himself when silence would have been safer. He chose words when weapons promised faster results. He chose the center when extremes offered louder applause. And he chose restraint when history tempted him with anger. These were not choices that guaranteed victory. They were choices that preserved meaning. For those who expected perfection, his life may feel incomplete. For those who measure leadership only by power held and battles won, his story may seem unfinished. But history is not only written by conquerors, it is also shaped by those who refuse to abandon their humanity when pressure demands cruelty. Azikiwe believed that the deepest form of freedom begins in the mind, that a people taught to doubt themselves would remain vulnerable long after chains were removed, and that education, memory, and self-respect were not luxuries, but defenses against erasure. He did not offer easy answers. He offered a way of standing, upright, even when misunderstood, calm, even when provoked, patient, even when history moved slowly. For the elders who listened to stories late in life, his journey speaks softly but firmly. It says that survival without dignity is not enough, that compromise without conscience leaves nothing to pass on, and that sometimes the greatest gift to future generations is not certainty, but example. His story belongs among history legends, not because it flatters us, but because it challenges us. It asks whether we are willing to think clearly when confusion surrounds us, whether we can resist hatred when it feels justified, whether we can hold our posture when the ground shifts beneath our feet. This is the quiet power of African history when it is told truthfully, not as a parade of dates, but as a record of choices, not as propaganda, but as memory restored to its rightful owners. These are not merely historical facts. They are instructions carried forward through time. Some will hear this story as history for sleep, a calm voice in the night, reminding them that their struggles are not isolated. Others will hear it as a mirror, reflecting the long road already traveled, and for many, it will affirm what Black history has always shown, that endurance, guided by thought, outlasts force. As long as these stories are told, something essential survives: the memory of standing upright, the discipline of choosing dignity, and the understanding that while power may come and go, posture is what remains. And as long as posture remains, so do the people.